Welcome to Drive the Daf, clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Eruvin Daf Mem Hey contains two Mishnayos right near each other on the same subject. From the beginning of the Daf until the Mishnayos, this discusses the issue of people who left their Tchum with permission. They went for an emergency, and how far back they're allowed to go. Have a contradiction between our Mishnah and a Brisa. The Gemara will give two answers to the contradiction, and then the Gemara will sidestep into the sugya of what are you allowed to be Machal Shabbos to save people from, what type of military emergencies are we allowed to respond, when are they considered to be Pikuach Nefesh. And the Mishnayos will take us into the subject of people who don't have Kavanah, they don't have intent to set up an Eruv Tchumin where their Tchum begins, if they were sleeping or if they were unaware, or even objects, what is their natural Tchum, and even objects which don't belong to anybody, what is their natural Tchum. So, first of all, we had seen in our Mishnah that there were a number of people who were allowed to leave the Tchum with permission. They're allowed to go out of the Tchum, and then their halacha was, once they're outside the Tchum and their job is finished, they have a new Tchum. They have 2,000 amos in every direction. But the Mishnah then said, the last line, it said that people who go out to save people, they're allowed to come back into their Tchum. So that seems to imply, even if their Tchum is more than 2,000 amos from where they are. Meaning to say that this is a greater leniency than our Mishnah had said in the rest of the Mishnah. The rest of the Mishnah had said they have a new Tchum of 2,000 amos around them, but if that doesn't get them back into their old Tchum, then they can't go back. But here we say, no, they can go back to their old Tchum even if it's 100,000 amos, however far it is. So Gemara asks that doesn't make sense. Gemara says, well, that's not necessarily a problem. It could be that this is a special leniency. Here we're talking about people who went out to go to war, to battle against an enemy in order to save the Jews. So it could be that they're allowed to run as far as they need to run, otherwise the enemy will chase them down. So that's where they're allowed to go back into the city. They can't stay out in the open. That would be not a safe place to be if you're in the middle of a war or if you just finished a war. So Gemara says, yeah, but even though you can answer like that, there are still contradictory brises. Our Mishnah says that they're allowed to go wherever they want, but there's a different brisa that says that they have 2,000 amos. And they can't go wherever they want. That brisa is longer. It starts as follows. It says that in the beginning of the halacha was that people who went to the Beis Din to testify that they saw that the moon had appeared and it was Rosh Chodesh, those people were allowed to leave their Tchum on Shabbos, but they weren't allowed to go back. They were stuck in their own 4 amos because now they're outside their Tchum. Then they made a takana. They instituted that they're allowed to have 2,000 amos in every direction when they're finished, and they added on to that a woman who goes to serve as a midwife, or somebody who goes to save people from robbers, or from a river, or from a collapsed building, or from a fire, or from an army. All these things they're allowed to go out, and they're allowed to. And once they're out and their job is finished, they have 2,000 amos in every direction. So here you see that even if they go out to war, they only have 2,000 amos, contradicting our mission that says that they can go as far as they want. So Gemara offers two answers to this contradiction. Can they go as far as they want back into the city, or only 2,000 amos? So Gemara says that one answer is that it depends who won the war. If the Jews won the war, so then they're safe, and then they don't have to go back into the city. If ever they lost, so then they have to run away completely to get back into the city. The other answer is that the Mishnah is not saying that they can go as far as they want. They really can't go as far as they want. What we're saying is that they're allowed to carry their weapons. When we say that they can go back, we mean that they could bring their weapons back with them. And to show that halacha, we quote a brisa that says in the beginning, when they returned from a war, they would leave their weapons in the first house they encountered. They didn't want to leave it out in the field, but they didn't want to carry it further than they had to. So the first house they encountered, they all stored their weapons there, and then they came back after Shabbos to get them. But it once happened that the enemy saw them and chased after them, and they went back to that house to get their weapons, and the house was crowded and small, and the enemy followed them in, and there was a huge confusion, and the Jews ended up killing each other even more than the enemy killed them. And therefore they made a rule from then on, they're allowed to carry their weapons with them, and that is the chiddush of this Mishnah, that they're allowed to continue to travel as far as they need to, even with the weapons to go along with them. Okay, now the Gemara says, when do we go out to fight against the Goyim on Shabbos? When are you allowed to be Mechal Shabbos to go to defend a city that has been surrounded by a troop. So Gemara says if they attacked a city for purposes of money, they just want a ransom, then you don't defend it on Shabbos. It's not pikuach nefesh. If, however, they came to kill people, so then, of course, it's pikuach nefesh. You can defend it on Shabbos. However, a city that's on the border, even if all they came was because they wanted to raid the storehouses of straw, you are allowed to defend it, because should they take control of the city, that would be a threat to the entire country, because it's a border town and it'll give them a window to get into the rest of the country. The Gemara says that a city in Bavel counts as a border town and has that halacha. What city is that? It's referring to Nahar Dal. Now the Gemara says you have a source for this from Psukim in Sefer Shmuel, where it says that the Pelishtim attacked a city that was near them, and they raided the storehouses of straw, and it was reported to David HaMelech, and he went and he asked the Urim V'Tumim, should I go attack them or not? And the answer was go, and you'll be able to save that town from these Pelishtim. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Distoi says, what was David HaMelech asking? He was asking if it is permitted to go save them carrying weapons on Shabbos. If that's what the question was, it's a halacha shayla. Halacha, you go ask Shmuel HaNavi. You go ask a Beis Din. You ask Sanhedrin. You don't go and ask the Urim V'Tumim. It's not there to paskin halachas. It must be that the question is that he was asking, will he be successful or not? And that makes sense, because it was clear that the halacha was that he's allowed to go because it was a border city. And successful is the question and answer show that that's what he was asking, because he asked, should I go? And the answer was, go and you'll be successful. So you see that his question was, will I be successful or not? Okay, we now have two Mishnayos, one right after the other. The first one discusses if a person is traveling along the road and he stops to rest, and then becomes Shabbos while he's resting, and he gets up and it's Shabbos already, and he didn't realize that he's within the tchum of a nearby city. So the question is, what is his tchum? Is his tchum the tchum of the city, because he's within the tchum of the city and therefore he should be a part of the city? Or, in order to make your tchum the tchum of the city, you have to intend to be part of the city. He didn't intend it. He didn't know what was going on. So therefore he's stuck in his own personal tchum, 2,000 amos in any direction. So it's a machlokes. According to Rabbi Meir, he has his personal tchum and he's not allowed to go into the city. According to Rabbi Yehuda, he has the tchum of the city. There is allowed to travel into the city, and then of course anywhere within the city itself, even outside of 2,000 amos from where he started Shabbos. So Yehuda says it was a story that happened with Rabbi Tarfon, and he was in this exact situation, and Rabbi Tarfon went into the city. So you see, that's a proof that you're allowed to go into the city itself. Now the Gemara is just a brisa. The Gemara quotes the brisa where Rabbi Yehuda brings Rabbi Tarfon's incident, and the Gemara says the brisa spells out what happened with Rabbi Tarfon more in detail. It says that he stopped outside the city, and he got up, and he saw that he was still outside, and he saw that he was close to the tchum, but it was already Shabbos. He stayed there all night, and in the morning, a bunch of cow herders came and said, look, you're close to the city. And then he went into the city, and he said, cheer in the Beis Medrash all day. So you see that he clearly holds you're allowed to go into the city just before he didn't realize that he was near the city. So Gemara says this is not a proof. First of all, it could be that the city was within his 2,000 amos. You don't know that he traveled in the rest of the 2,000. You don't know that he traveled outside of his own 2,000 amat chum in the rest of the city. It could be the fact that he went to the Beis Medrash was just because the Beis Medrash was within his 2,000 amos. And the other option over here is that maybe he really did know what was going on. He did realize that he was close to the city. He spent the night out of the town for whatever reason, but when Shabbos began, he knew that he was close to the city, and he had in mind that he's going to have the tchum of the city be his tchum. Okay, now starts the next Mishnah, and this introduces the discussion of when you establish your own personal permanent residence for Shabbos. Your Makam Shvisa for Shabbos, and of course you will have your 2,000 Am B'Tchum based on where your Makam Shvisa is. And the question over here is, do you have to have intent that this is my Makam Shvisa, or it happens automatically? Beyond not having intent, what happens if you're sleeping and you don't even realize anything? You were like an inanimate object. Do you get an automatic 2,000 Amas Makam Shvisa, or do you get no Makam Shvisa at all? You're stuck with 4 Amas. You have no Tchum whatsoever. And this will take us in the Gemara to the subject of inanimate objects. What is their Tchum? Is their Tchum the Tchum of their owners? Whatever their owners are allowed to go, they're allowed to be moved, or do they not have a Tchum at all? And of course, even further than that will be, what if something is an inanimate object but has no owner? So does it get any Tchum? Or does it have no Tchum? Or does its Tchum depend on the first person who comes along and lifts it up? These are the options over here. So the Mishnah starts off by saying somebody who's on the road and he lies down to sleep, and he's asleep when Shabbos begins. So does he have a Tchum or not? So according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, he has a regular 2,000 Am Tchum. He does not have to be awake in order to gain a Tchum. According to the Chachamim, he doesn't get a Tchum. He doesn't have a Makam Shvisa. He's outside his Tchum, and when he wakes up, he has only 4 Amas in any direction. How do these 4 Amas work? Machlekes, or Elazar says he's in the center of a 4 Amma circle. He's allowed to go 2 Amas in every direction. Rabbi Yehuda says no, he could choose where he wants to be in the 4 Amas. He could choose that he's on the edge of the 4 Amas, and then he could move 4 Amas in the other direction, in any direction, but he can only choose one direction. If he's choosing his 4 Amas, so then that's wherever he decides his 4 Amas are, he can't switch it afterwards. He has to be anywhere within the 4 Amas. He could be on the edge of the circle, but he can't move it and afterwards say, no, really I was on the edge of the circle, and the circle extends in the opposite direction. Okay, now, if there were 2 people, and they each were sleeping, and they each have a 4 Amma Tchum, so if their Tchums, it's not really a Tchum, it's really a Rishus HaYachid. The 4 Amas is not a Tchum that you have when you're outside the city. The 4 Amas is that Chazal said that the 4 Amas that you're in is considered to be your own personal Rishus HaYachid, even if there's no walls there. So if there's 2 guys, so they each have a 4 Amas. Now if their 4 Amas overlap, they're allowed to meet and have a Suda together in the middle, only in the part that overlaps. One is not allowed to leave his Tchum, is not allowed to hand any object out of his personal 4 Amma Rishus HaYachid to the other person, or in the other person's Rishus HaYachid. Rashi gives 2 explanations here, either because the objects also have a limited 4 Amas, and they're not allowed to leave their 4 Amas that the owner is in, or because the objects are in Rishus HaYachid now, because this entire 4 Amma area is considered your Rishus HaYachid. If you pass it out, that would be passing from Rishus HaYachid to Rishus HaRabim, and that will be called carrying. Now if there are 3 people, all lined up in a row like a chain, and the middle one overlaps the other 2, the other 2 have their 4 Amma areas touching each other but not overlapping, and this middle guy overlaps the 2 of them, so he's allowed to go in either of their tchums, but the 2 on the ends are not allowed to meet in the middle because they have no overlap. Now the Gemara says this is very similar, the Mishnah says this is very similar to a case where you have 3 chatzeros, 3 private courtyards that are near each other, and the middle one has an Erev Chatzeris with both of the ones on the end, but the ones on the end do not have an Erev Chatzeris with each other. So that's the same situation. The middle one is allowed to go to their Erev Chatzeris, to their Chatzeris. The outer ones are allowed to go to the middle one, but they're not allowed to go from end to end because there is no Erev Chatzeris between them. Now Rashi explains that it has to be that they're each open to Rishus HaRabim, because otherwise it will be forbidden altogether to walk from one to the other unless each one had a separate door to Rishus HaRabim. Gemara now begins, and it wants to analyze the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, who says that the person who's asleep gets a tchum. He gets a makom shvisa, he gets a permanent residence, and he gets a tchum, as opposed to the other opinion says he does not. The Gemara wants to know what's the pshat in Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. He holds that an object automatically gets a tchum, and this would apply to anything, even to a hefker object that has no owner. Wherever it is, it gets a tchum, and even though this guy's asleep, he is not any worse than a hefker object, and therefore he gets a tchum. Or does Rabbi Yochanan Nuri not hold that way? Rabbi Yochanan Nuri holds no. Really, a hefker object cannot get a tchum. This person gets a tchum because even though now he's sleepy and he's like a hefker object, but he's not really a hefker object. He's a person. If he would be awake, he could get a tchum. Therefore, when he's asleep, he also gets a tchum automatically. And the only reason that they argued about this, so if that's the reason that he holds that the sleeping person gets a tchum, so then I understand why they argued about this case specifically, because he wouldn't say that. There would be no argument in the case of an object. If, however, the argument exists even on an object, and Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri holds that any hefker object gets a tchum, so the reason why the Mishnah discussed the case of the sleeping person is because to show you that even in that case the Rabbanan do not agree, and they hold that a sleeping person does not get a tchum, even though if he would be awake he would. So Gemara says that I can prove to you that Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri does hold that hefker onos objects get an automatic tchum, and an object can have a tchum. It doesn't have to be a person that has a tchum. And my proof is from a brisa. The brisa says that what's halacha of rain that falls on Yom Tov? So if it falls on Yom Tov, so then it began Yom Tov nowhere. It had no tchum, and therefore it has no tchum, and it is hefker. It can be taken or moved or used by anyone. It has no limits. It didn't exist in the beginning of a Shabbos. It's not that it's outside the tchum, and the concept of tchum doesn't exist for it. If, however, it fell before Yom Tov, so then wherever it landed, that is its tchum, and it has 2,000 amas in any direction. So that clearly shows that a hefker object, rainwater, has a tchum of 2,000 amas. So there has to be somebody who holds that way. It must be that it's Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, because the Chachamim for sure do not hold that way. So Gemara says that Abai says to Rav Safra, and Rav Safra said, how do you know that that's pshat, that's Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, and it's because the object has its own tchum. Maybe just the rainwater fell in the city, and therefore it has the tchum of the city. That's what it means. So Abai answered him, he says, you can't say that, because you have two contradictory brises, and that it still proves anyway that Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri holds anyway that an object gets a tchum. The two contradictory brises are discussing well water. One brisa says well water depends what tchum it's in. If the well belongs to an individual, then it has the tchum of its owner. If it belongs to a city, then it has the tchum of the city. And if it's just along the road and it's not anywhere, then it has the tchum of whoever fills it up first. Whoever comes along, he's allowed to use it, and it applies to his tchum, meaning the hefker object has no automatic tchum. There's a different brisa that says that a well on the side of the road has 2,000 amas tchum. The water cannot be moved outside of that 2,000 amas. So you see, again, you have a hefker object. One opinion says that it has a tchum. One opinion says it does not. It must be Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri and the Chachamim. Fine. Later, Abayi related this whole conversation to Rabbi Yosef, who was his Rebbe. He said, "This is what Rav Safra asked. This is what I answered him." Rabbi Yosef said, "You could have answered him a much better answer. You could have said, look at the brisa about the rainwater. It says the rainwater fell before Yom Tov. It has a 2,000 amas tchum. Rav Safra wants to say that means that it fell in the city and therefore it has the tchum of the city. That's not what it says. It doesn't say it has the tchum of the city. It says it has 2,000 amas. That means that it has its own tchum. You can't tell me that it's the tchum of the city. That's what it means. It very much doesn't fit in the words. Okay, now on the subject of rainwater, the Gemara finds it interesting what the tchum of rainwater is. The Gemara says, for 1 second. First of all, we have a machlokes where rainwater comes from. Rabbi Eliezer says it comes from the Atlantic Ocean, or the oceans of the world. And there's another opinion, which the Gemara doesn't quote, that says that it's not from the oceans. So the Gemara says, this brisa here would seem to be a proof against Rabbi Eliezer, because if it came from the oceans, so why do we say that rainwater that fell on Yom Tov has no tchum? It didn't have a tchum existing at all. It had a tchum. It was in the ocean. That's where it began Yom Tov, and therefore it was in the ocean. Now it's outside its tchum. It should be limited. So Gemara says no, not necessarily. It could be that we are really assuming that rainwater comes from the oceans, but here it was already clouds. The clouds are already in the sky when Yom Tov began, so it was in the clouds. In clouds, you can't get a tchum. So Gemara says, well, if that's true, you're assuming that the reason why it has a tchum is because it was in the clouds. The reason why it's not limited to the ocean's tchum, and therefore it's already outside its tchum and forbidden, is because it was in the clouds already. How do you know that these are the same clouds? Maybe those clouds disappeared, and these are new water that came out of the ocean on Yom Tov, and therefore it began Yom Tov in the ocean, and its tchum is limited to what it had in the ocean, and therefore you can't use it anymore. So Gemara says, so you had a siman, you could tell that it's the same clouds. You recognize the clouds, and therefore you know it's not from the ocean. Or maybe you're right, it's a suffix. I don't know if it came from the ocean or not. I don't know if its tchum is from the ocean or not. A suffix on an isser, the rabbanon is permitted. We could assume that it's clouds that were overhead the whole time, and that it's not water that was in the ocean, and those clouds disappeared. So Gemara says, well, we had a discussion earlier if there is halachas of tchumen above 10 tfachim. So these water that's in the clouds are above 10 tfachim. If there are tchumen above 10 tfachim, then this water, even though it fell on Yom Tov, should be limited to the tchum that it had at the beginning of Yom Tov, wherever the clouds were, underneath the clouds that they were in. This must prove that there are no tchum, because the Brisa said that there is no tchum for rainwater that fell on Yom Tov. It did not exist in a tchum applicable state. It has no limitations. So obviously, up in the sky doesn't have tchumen. So Gemara says not necessarily. It could be that up in the sky has tchumen, but this rainwater is not considered to be existing water. It's in a different state. In clouds, it's not water. It's something else. It's vapor, whatever it is. So it's not that this is a new object. When it rains, it becomes a new thing, and therefore it didn't exist at all when Yom Tov began. And clouds is not considered to be the same. So Gemara says if that's the case, then it's for sure also to use on Yom Tov. It's noilad, something which is created on Yom Tov is forbidden. So Gemara says, okay, so we'll drop that. It's not that it didn't exist. The clouds are water droplets. They do exist, but the clouds move around. It's something which moves, doesn't get a tchum. Like we've seen in Brisa, which says that flowing streams and rivers and springs don't get a tchum because they move too much, and therefore whoever picks it up, that's where their tchum becomes decided.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.